you may also be more satisfied with overall transit service. And sure enough, a recent study at the University of Maryland on their shuttle bus system found significant increases in overall satisfaction with the shuttle buses because of real-time information. And more recently, a study was conducted in Chicago to look at ridership impacts. So if you're waiting less, that's less travel time, you're more satisfied, well, are you more likely to actually ride the system? Which is really the question that most transit agencies want to know. And so this study, which was done between 2002 and 2010, found a very modest increase in bus ridership. Precisely 126 rides per route, which is about 1 to 2% of route level ridership. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this Chicago study. There we go. Because I'm following up on the same question, really trying to understand, well, this study was done, it culminated in 2010. Since then, as Aditi told us earlier, we've seen dramatic increases in the adoption of technologies like smartphones. So as the authors of the Chicago study acknowledged, during their study period, there were relatively low levels of technology adoption. Furthermore, the type of real-time information application changed a lot. In Chicago, they started with just a web interface, and then they added a BlackBerry app. Who even uses BlackBerries anymore? And then only at the very end of their study period, they had Android and iPhone applications. And furthermore, they weren't sure of the levels of awareness. Do our riders even know in Chicago how high, if that there is real-time information? So what we're looking for is a place where there is high level of technology adoption, many different interfaces, so as many people as possible can access real-time information, and that people are aware of it. Maybe someone that's done a good marketing campaign. Well, New York, conveniently, happens to have all three of these. So they started rolling out their real-time information nearly 5 years after Chicago. And so they started this in about 2011, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so there were very high levels of smartphone adoption at that point. A small survey, for example, in Staten Island showed over 50% of riders already had smartphones. They launched multiple different interfaces at once, a web interface, a mobile web interface. They opened their data, so smartphone apps were created. And they conducted a very thorough marketing campaign by actually placing information on the bus stop. So on poles out of bus stops, which they call guide rides in New York City, there's all sorts of marketing telling you this is how you get real-time information. So for that reason, I'm revisiting the question on ridership in New York. What you're looking at here is the screenshot of the MTA's web-based interface. So just like many of the other real-time information systems throughout the country, you can search it by route, by intersection, by bus stop code. I should note, for those of you who use One Bus Away here in Atlanta or in Tampa, this looks fairly similar, as it's based off of the same code. It has some user interface differences, but it is part of the One Bus Away suite. A few key things to note, for those of you who haven't memorized the geography of New York City, there are 5 boroughs, and bus time was rolled out on a borough-by-borough basis. So it started in Brooklyn with just one single bus route. It was a pilot at the beginning of 2011. Then, given its success on the single bus route, was launched on all bus routes, in Staten Island in the beginning of 2012. This was followed by all of the Bronx, Manhattan, and just 2 weeks ago, Queens and Brooklyn complete bus time. So now, any bus route you go to in New York City, you can access real-time information. Since the Queens and Brooklyn launch just happened, they're not included in my study. I'm closing the period of analysis for the data that you'll see in just a minute with the Manhattan launch. So I go up through the end of 2013. And what I'm looking at is the ridership for a 3-year panel beginning at January 2011 and continuing until December 2013. And what this is, it's the average weekday bus ridership by borough. So you'll see on the top is Brooklyn, which has the highest bus ridership. This is an average weekday in Brooklyn. For example, in March, when most ridership peaks, is nearly 700,000 trips per day. So this is a massive bus system. And then our smallest borough by far, which is Staten Island, has just shy of about 100,000 average weekday rides on it. computer's a little slow. There we go. So the data that I'm using in my analysis, so the dependent variable in my regression models is what you were just looking at. It's average weekday bus ridership at the route level, and the time unit of analysis is per month. That data was provided to me directly by New York City Transit. Then, to try to explain what is changing, I have many different transit-related variables. So first and foremost, I have bus time, if real-time information is available on that route in the given month. I have the average weekday revenue miles on that route. This is a measure of bus service. So I'm taking into account how long the route is, because it's revenue miles, how frequent it is, etc. I also have a few others, including the fare, which is the same for both the bus and the rail base fare. The rail system-wide revenue miles, as well as the number of vehicles operated during the peak period, or maximum service. In addition to these transit-related vehicles, I have many different external factors that could affect overall transit ridership. So first is the availability of bike sharing. So right in the middle of my study period, a brand new mode was introduced in New York City. They launched a massive bike share program in Manhattan and in Brooklyn. So I've accounted for that in 2013. I have some standard variables you see in most models, including population, gas prices, unemployment rate, and then a series of weather variables. So I have temperature, including the number of hot days or cold days per month, which do affect ridership, snowfall, precipitation, and also Hurricane Sandy, which also happened in the middle of my study. So the methodology I'm using is panel regression. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with standard OLS, ordinary least squares regression models. So in this case, the dependent variable y is your route level bus ridership. So I, my individual, is the route, and then time period is the month. It's dependent on all those explanatory variables we just talked about, for some which are route specific, some which are city specific over the time period. Problem with this is that because we're looking at repeated observations, this is panel data, we see correlation. So on the same route over and over. So we take that into account using some fairly standard econometric techniques. So I'm primarily looking at two different types of models, random effects models and fixed effects models. A random effect model introduces a route-specific intercept, which will take into account the heterogeneity for each individual route. And a fixed effects differences out the average for each route over time. I'm also investigating some more complicated specifications with some additional structure in the error terms, but so far the basic random and fixed effects are looking pretty good. So to give you a flavor for what I'm finding, this is a fixed effects linear regression model. While this table is a little overwhelming, I'm going to try to walk you through it one by one here. So in the upper left, we see the impact of fares. As fares go up, it's a negative coefficient, we see ridership go down, as one would expect, very significantly. We see a bit of a mixed effect on the rail side. So when we're increasing the number of vehicles in the peak, so the maximum service, we see a decrease in bus ridership. But when we look at the overall rail service, we actually see an increase. So potentially suggesting a complementary effect. So as rail ridership goes up, bus ridership may also go up. Still looking at this a little more though. Gas prices and population aren't playing a significant role so far. Unemployment rate, as it goes up, we see a decrease in bus ridership, which makes sense as it's an indicator of the general macroeconomic conditions of the city. Interesting things with the weather, Hurricane Sandy actually increased bus ridership in the month that it occurred. According to the folks at the MTA, this is likely because the rail system was flooded. So the quickest way to get around in the immediate aftermath, bus service recovered quicker. So we did see an increase during that time in bus ridership. And then most of the other weather variables cause a decrease in ridership. So if there's a lot of snow, a lot of rain, etc., we see most ridership go down. Bus service, all of the variables, I've done categorized these by borough. But overall, as you increase the revenue miles of bus service, you see a very significant increase in bus ridership, as you would expect. Now, bike sharing, on the other hand, caused what appears to be a decrease in bus ridership. So the two boroughs where this was launched actually appear to have experienced some minor decreases in bus ridership, potentially suggesting that, for example, short trips that you might have done on a local bus route are now being done through the bike sharing program. And last but not least, real-time information. So I'm looking at this on a borough-by-borough basis. The first two areas where bus time was launched, on the single bus route in Brooklyn, the pilot, and Staten Island, I did not see an effect. Now, these are very small areas, so Staten Island by far has the lowest amount of bus ridership. But then in the Bronx and Manhattan, we are seeing an increase. So in the Bronx, it's approximately 400 rides per average weekday per route. And in Manhattan, about 200 average rides per weekday per route. This is about 1.5% of Manhattan ridership, or 2.5% in the Bronx. But as I said, I'm still working on the model, so it may change a little bit as I continue to investigate this. So preliminary conclusions, real-time information is having an effect in many areas of the city, particularly the Bronx and Manhattan, where ridership is very high. And it may be slightly greater than the Chicago study, which found about 1%, almost 2% in some areas as well. But I'm continuing to evaluate the model specifications and trying a few more tweaks to it. And potentially may expand the panel in the future to look at least extending the Manhattan timeframe, which I only have about 3 months of Manhattan real-time in my study. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions for Candace? Okay, we'll take it. You're next, then.
Yeah. You're right, the ridership increase may not be vast right now, but most transit agencies are saying, hey, this is the way I can improve my transit system without improving my transit system. Which is, who can argue with that? And also some of the things we're talking about in terms of weather and all that stuff. Another thing, especially for female passengers, is just a sense of security. They may not want to stand at a dark bus stop in a neighborhood that may not be particularly safe any longer, and they absolutely have to. And so it's good for that as well. It might be encouraging. I noticed the Bronx was the one that increased the most, and maybe that's the more dangerous place.
Okay. I think you're next.
Yeah. So. So our next speaker is Dr. Joel Volinski, the director of the UTC at the University of South Florida, who has been doing transit-related research for a number of years. And so we're excited to have him talk about maintaining transit effectiveness under major fiscal constraints, especially in light of what we were hearing this morning from our GDOT friends. So with that.
Very good, thank you, Carrie. This project is one that was funded through the Transit Cooperative Research Program. For those of you not familiar, it's a federal program that funds anywhere between $3 and $10 million worth of research a year. And the final report should be coming out hopefully soon, sometime in the spring of this year. And the intent was to find how transit agencies had performed to maintain their effectiveness during the dark days of the so-called Great Recession, from about late 2008 to through about 2012, and in some communities still regrettably having a major impact on their ability to do their work. The real essence of this is to find out what transit agencies did to either become more efficient and save money, or to generate new non-traditional revenues. Either way, it helps those transit agencies not raise their fares as much or not ask for more tax support as much. It's either newfound money or savings that they have found from different parts of their agency. I won't go into too much depth, we don't have a lot of time, but we did send the survey out to 46 different agencies, 40 of them replied. We did a very considerable literature research, but a different kind, which relied more on recent articles and things like journals and magazines that serve the public transit industry, rather than scholarly articles, because I was looking for the most recent actions that have been taken. And lots of newspapers. Maybe some of you get services from around the country each day that highlight stories in a particular area. These are the folks that, or the location of the transit agencies that responded. Our apologies to the flyover states that got flown over again, but they did have a chance to do the survey if they wanted to. But you can see it's in 17 different states in various parts of the country. And in terms of the types of agencies that responded, there was a nice mix. Of the 40, 10 of them were large systems with more than 500 vehicles. The plurality was medium systems. I think there were 17 of those that responded with between 100 and 500 vehicles, and then 13 that had a relatively smaller fleet. Gary, I don't know, this might look familiar to you, this picture. Back in those bad days, this is a MARTA bus that they put red X's over the doors of a lot of the buses, warning people that, hey, we're in serious trouble if something isn't done either by the state or the feds or someone. This bus won't be here next time you're expecting it to come by. And of course, I won't go over all the uglies and horribles that they all lived through. These things like layoffs and furloughs and eliminations of vacancies, etc. A lot of people, of course, were hurt by this because 84% of the agencies indicated that they were either going to raise their fares or cut service. And you can see some of these headlines from around the country that really did look pretty bad, and it was pretty bad. And there were service reductions galore throughout the country. The most frequent one being a reduction of service on low demand routes, which you would expect that's what you're going to cut first if you have to cut it all. But also reducing the frequency on many routes, or eliminating some routes altogether, reducing weekend service, things of that sort. Employees also found that they had to really take maybe many of you are in the same situation over these past 5 or 6 years at universities, maybe not. Very few raises and a lot of givebacks by employees and transit agencies, particularly having to pay more for their health insurance and things like that. But in some cases it was really serious. We've talked about Washington State here a little bit, and those folks really took it on the chin worse than any other. And one agency reported they had to cut 30% of their administrative staff in their transit agency. And those were tough and dark days for them, and a lot of grieving and a lot of actual survivor's guilt by those who were not let go. And it was simply a tough time. But they did a lot of different things to cope with it. And while I know not many of you work at, or maybe any of you work at transit systems, this is not analysis, this is a synthesis. And it's just a recap of and an identification of all these things that transit systems did to try to keep their head above water. Many of them reported that they did end up outsourcing certain functions, particularly vehicle operations. In other words, the actual bus service that was out there was given to a private contractor to operate. And typically when you do that, you will save between about 20 and 30%, but it ends up being a headache with organized labor for sure. Some vehicle maintenance was contracted out as well as facility maintenance, and in some cases administrative functions were contracted out, particularly dealing with sick leave and the Federal Medical Leave Act. They found that there was much more expertise among the private sector to deal with those kind of things than they had in-house. So, while a majority of the agencies indicated that they were providing fewer hours in 2012 than they were in 2008, another majority simply also said that they were carrying more passengers per hour and more total passengers in 2012 than 2008, which is a nice sign. It means that you don't waste a good crisis, I guess. You get rid of stuff that you couldn't get rid of in better times. Because you had the money to fund these routes that weren't very productive. Well, now you don't. So let's take advantage of that situation to get rid of those routes if we can, or that service. And they've become much more efficient. So we did ask how agencies felt they were doing, comparing 2012 to 2018. And as you can see, 50% either said they were doing more with less, or they were doing more with the same. So you get that sense that, yeah, you know, these were tough times to go through, but we're actually, we're operating more efficiently now than we used to. One of the big reasons that transit agencies' performance has improved is that they've become much more data-driven. And what we have up here is a list of agencies that have gone through different processes to be able to collect data and make it meaningful and useful for them in terms of business intelligent responses to the various challenges that they had. In Cleveland, it was really good. They came up with something called Transit Stat. And it's really just using a basic program that's available to anyone with a Microsoft Office suite. And they were able to track virtually everything they were doing in the transit agency and be able to come up with solutions based on not just the data coming off of the charts and graphs, but gathering together once a week as a management team and working collaboratively to come up with analysis and solutions. And in doing that, they saved about $15 million over 2 years. The bottom thing, the American bus benchmarking group, is something that about 18 agencies are engaged in now, and in this situation they send their operating data over to a university in London. I can't remember the name of it. They pay about $10,000 a year to be a part of this group, and what they can then do is do some peer comparisons between themselves in terms of, okay, we think we're doing pretty well compared to ourselves over the last few years, but how are we doing compared to others throughout the country? A lot more efficient bus operations are taking place right now, and it's primarily because of technology. They're using automated passenger counters that can track passengers when they get on, when they get off. They can analyze ridership by route, by segment of route, by time of day of the week. Really almost surgically precise at this point, to the point where some systems said, yeah, we eliminated 40,000, 50,000 hours of service, and our ridership did not go down. Which is pretty amazing, and also begs the question, why didn't they do it sooner? But nonetheless, they did it when they had to, and that's a good thing for them. A number of agencies had some basic service design changes, especially when they were serving low-density areas. They wouldn't do it through fixed route anymore. They might do it through some sort of deviated fixed route, where they could do both paratransit and transit, fixed route transit at the same time. I've touched on this a little bit, that 74% says they say they increased passengers per hour and 62% increased passengers per mile. I'll go over very quickly some of the savings that were found. And in the case of paratransit, you're probably not going to reduce your costs, but the main challenge is to contain your costs, because in some systems that are going up 25% a year, you just can't survive with that kind of growth rate. So in this case, we're looking at a picture out in Orange County, California, where they set up an assessment center with a bus and with a total simulated environment, the streets and the street signs and traffic lights and everything else, and they could then determine if people could or could not use the fixed route transit system. And a lot of other things that could be done to help reduce the cost of paratransit by incorporating taxis into your regular paratransit fleet. Partnering with nonprofit local agencies that could, if you could give them a van and give them a little bit of training, they can carry some of the people that you used to be carrying. A lot of ways to help keep the cost, like I said, contained. Maintenance efficiencies. There are more and more places that are moving to electrification of bus components, where they go from hydraulic to electrification to deal with their air conditioning systems, engine cooling systems, power steering. And when they do that, you can save about 15% on your fuel usage, and that's big because fuel is about the third most expensive expense item in a transit system. A lot of agencies are going to CNG, which does have a good price differential right now, and we don't know how long that will last, probably quite a while, and that'll save them money over the long run. I can't do all of these different activities, but the report will be out, and there's just hundreds of activities that we found that they can save money or make money. Greener facilities, a lot of agencies now, whenever they build anything, are using the LEED system, and in doing so, here's just one example from Philadelphia, SEPTA, that in just their one headquarters building, they're saving $100,000 a year in utility costs by doing all these various, really fairly simple things in their building. More ways of reducing utility costs, which may be the fourth highest expense for a transit system, where they can cooperate with their local power provider to say that, okay, when we have high usage throughout our community, we'll volunteer to use our generators to power ourselves at that point, and it really reduces their rate structure significantly. And the picture on the bottom is out in San Jose, California, where they built solar panels, canopies over their buses out in the bus yard. And they're going to be making a couple of $1 million on this over the next 15 years. And of course, reducing their carbon footprint as well. Healthcare costs are also a major driver of expenses in transit systems. Can't go over too many of these things, but I'll just point at the first one. Most systems have said, hey, we'll accept some of the risk ourselves now. Instead of just paying a premium to insurance companies and not having any control over it, we'll take the risk on the first $100,000 of any claims. And after that, we'll have an umbrella policy, because in the system in Tampa, they found that they had actually paid more than $5 million more than what more in premiums than what the actual claims were during the previous 5 years. So they say, we'll accept the risk, but then they also put in the wellness programs, and they provide incentives for employees to join wellness programs, and it helps the health of each person in the agency, and it helps the health of their budget. Lots of technology. I've already talked about automatic passenger counters, automated vehicle locators, signal priority. All of these things are helping to provide a better service, improve scheduling. If you can save a few minutes here and there, it's important. Let's see, what else can I point out here? Well, security cameras, almost everybody has them now, and it's great to make sure that if you do have an accident, you don't get a lot of claims against you. Even if you're only carrying 5 people, suddenly you got 20 claims against you when you have an accident in the transit agency, and those cameras help to prevent that. Candace just talked about the next bus, or one bus away type of system. And out in San Jose, they've also developed a text bus that they developed for about $15,000, and it provides real-time information on demand at each bus stop that they can get through text messages with the transit system there. And the social media was touched on, I think, a little bit earlier, improving customer information in a significant way. That printed expenses for schedules and maps and things of that nature have been drastically reduced. So it's all on websites, it's all on your smartphone. They don't have to print anywhere near as much as they used to have to print. There are some things they're doing that are interesting to generate some new revenues. One is, you see on the bottom left, is a bus that has an advertising sign on it. You've probably all seen advertising on buses, but this happens to be an LED advertising sign, which helps you to change messages every 10 seconds if you want, or time it as you go past certain businesses if you want. And you can see it at night where you can't with regular vinyl. And that can bring in about 4 times the amount of revenue that a regular vinyl sign could. We've probably seen these sort of vinyl covers on buses and trains. It's becoming much more prevalent. Audio advertising is now available in a number of bus systems around the country. You get on board, there'll be a transit radio network on. It'll give you news, weather, sports, and well, it also may tell you the next stop, but it also gives you a commercial. And some of these mid-sized systems are making about $100,000 a year with that sort of thing. This is kind of neat. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it. In Chicago and in Boston and some parts of New York, the transit systems have linked up with Peapod. And if you've got a smartphone and you're on your way through one of the tunnels or whatever in a transit system, this is a virtual grocery store. You can put your smartphone up against the Q code of whatever it is that you're interested in buying. It will record what it is you want to buy, and you might want to buy a whole bunch of things, and by the time you get home, that stuff will be delivered to you. So it's a great convenience for customers, and it's also an income generator for the transit system. Same thing on the bottom right, you'll see the financial institutions in places like Chicago are willing to pay a lot of money, $1 million per year, so that they can put their ATM machines in the locations of transit centers. Naming rights at certain places, like go back to Brooklyn, the Barclays Center, they're paying $4 million to name the new train station there after their company. SEPTA did it with AT&T, and Chicago did it with Apple, and other places are doing it in the same fashion. And if you had to cut staff, one thing they did do is, hey, we got empty offices, what can we realize from that? Well, they leased out the empty offices, and in places like Philadelphia, it earned them over $7 million. It's the only silver lining to a dark cloud that they had there. Keep going. And many examples of becoming partners with what I would say, non-traditional partners. Military bases that might be nearby. There was a case in Monterey, California, where there's a place called Presidio Naval Training Center, and they didn't want to have all their employees bringing cars onto their campus, primarily because of security these days. And so they teamed together with a transit agency, and they took advantage of a federal provision which allows employees at the military base to receive a transportation benefit. At that time it was $235 a month. It's been reduced now. But every one of the persons that lived there or worked there got that. And they converted all of that money into new bus routes that served that base, but also served the rest of the community, and they made $1.6 million and converted it into new service. Many people are aware of the partnership with universities. Not so many are aware of partnerships that are done with public schools, high schools, and junior high schools primarily, where, again, new revenue is coming in because it's cheaper for the schools to subsidize their kids to use the public transit system than it is to run the yellow school bus. Plenty of examples of working together with downtown development authorities who are interested in having shuttles downtown, convention centers that, again, don't want to build huge parking structures if they can avoid it. There's also partnerships with private partners, whether it's these that you see here listed. Hospitals in particular seem to really enjoy working with transit systems as they expand and they have to reduce their parking, and they say, hey, if you can provide us a shuttle service from here to there, we will pay you for it. Out in Los Angeles, if any of you have gone to the Getty Museum, it's up on a kind of a high hill overlooking the city, and the only way you get there is by taking the big blue bus to go up there, and they reached an agreement with the museum to pay for all of that. Business parks, many of whom locate out in the sort of the outer reaches of suburbia, they are willing to pay for the shuttle from, let's say, the nearest train stop to their business park. And the list goes on and on. However, my time doesn't go on and on. So I will say they found a little bit of opportunity. Marin County out there in San Francisco area, California, they passed an increase of $10 in vehicle registration fees, which generated $2 million for transportation, and transit gets about a third of that. Rhode Island got together with a number of environmental groups out in that state, and they managed to pass a 2-cent gas tax statewide, with all the proceeds going to transit, which is nice for them. In Virginia and Maryland, we heard the Commissioner of Georgia speak to us earlier this morning about, the feds aren't, who knows if the feds are going to do anything, they probably won't. So it's really kind of up to the states at this point to pick up the slack. And in Virginia and Maryland, basically they decided to go ahead and tax internet purchases, and with the proceeds from that, they're going to be putting most of that money into transportation improvements, including transit. And in some places they have put surcharges on tickets to major concerts, to major sporting events. And so that's a real quick rundown of some of the things the transit agencies did during those times. And it helped them then, but it's going to help them going forward as well. And as I said, sometimes when you do get into a bad situation, necessity is the mother of invention. And while they weren't doing it before, you can get lazy when things are kind of comfortable. But when it's not comfortable, you really do have to dig down and find out what you can do differently. So with that, I appreciate your attention, and the report will be coming out from TCRP hopefully within a month or two, and at that point you can see the hundreds of things that I didn't talk about. Here.
Thank you, Joel. Are there questions?
I think you may have alluded to this at the beginning. I was just curious how many transit agencies that you surveyed had the double whammy of both service cuts and fare hikes simultaneously? Because I know that was the threat at many of the major agencies for the public.
Actually, Candace, I don't have that number specifically. We did talk about some of the numbers. 84% said they were going to do one or the other, and then I would be willing to bet it was more like about 35 to 40% that did. And what they found was that people would say, hey, please raise my fare if you have to, but don't cut my service. I mean, it's just too important. And so where they could, that's probably what they did. And where they did cut service, they cut it, like I say, as surgically as they possibly could. By the way, that was an APTA survey. I didn't do that survey stuff.
In Florida, they have, as you know, the local option gas tax in some of the counties, and I understand it's a multimodal tax. Do you see any trends across the country for local option gas taxes that can be used for transit?
Well, I think the trends we see is that when referendums are held in different parts of the country, and they're, well, about 70 to 80% of them are passing when it's for transit. Now, some of it is for improvement, but some of it is just to keep what you've got. So just keeping what you've got doesn't impress me that much, but for those who have passed some kind of tax, whether it was a local option gas tax or like what Marin County did with registration fees, it doesn't really matter what the source is as long as it results in new money. I think the better case that can be made for what you're going to do with that money, when and where, the better your chances are of getting it passed. As a matter of fact, San Jose State University, they do a real good job of assessing these referendums and figuring out, why didn't it pass, why did it pass, and they do, post-referendum surveys and things like that. But to answer your question, yes, I do see a trend, and but I think it's going to depend on just how good the transit agency is perceived in the community. And by doing all these things that I just described, it certainly enhances their reputation as better managers. Hey, we've done everything we can do and more. So please, at this point, we've exhausted all of our creativity. We need your help too.
Great. Last one.
So with CNG becoming so attractive at the same time when you had the economic crisis.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the first word?
Yeah, with the CNG.
Oh, CNG, yes.
Very attractive.
Yeah.
Just at the same time when you had the economic crisis, did you see a lot of agencies switching to CNG-powered vehicles? And if so, what was the percentage? And if it wasn't 100%, what would be the reason why some agencies didn't choose that option?
Yeah, I think usually when they don't, it comes down to the maintenance manager. They don't have any familiarity or experience with it, and they're scared of it. And other people tend to get a little bit frightened at the thought of explosions with natural gas and things of that sort. There are a number of systems that have been doing this for 35 years, and they've had very good success. And I think it's really, it isn't so much because of the financial crisis as much as it was some lobbying on the part of the CNG industry. I mean, for instance, down in Florida where I am, I asked the transit agency managers, what issues are you dealing with that we could possibly help you with? They said, we're getting hammered by the CNG industry going to our board and saying, you're really missing out on this opportunity, you ought to build the infrastructure, et cetera. So there's a lot of pressure. You've probably seen the commercials on TV about how much CNG resources we've got in the country. We're the Saudi Arabia of CNG. So I mean, it just makes a lot of sense. And at this point, I think you'll see a whole lot more agencies do it, and it's a matter of the infrastructure that serves the area more than anything else.
Okay, great. Let's thank Joel. So our last speaker in this session is Dr. Jeff LaMondia from Auburn, who's going to talk about some joint research going on at Auburn and with my group here at Georgia Tech to actually develop course materials that can be integrated into different classes so that we can have a better understanding of how the public transportation world works. And I believe he's going to talk a little bit in general about the project as well as some surveys that we did of the workforce to understand what they feel like people should understand better about transit to educate them. Great. So with that, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Carrie. Yes, as Carrie said, this is kind of a joint project that's happened between Georgia Tech and Auburn University. And I'll be talking about how we went about developing this new course in transit education. So it's kind of a bigger picture than everything we've been talking about up until now. We're educating people to do the cool things that you guys are working on. And I should mention that this was funded through Stride, which has been great support for this. So, and also I should mention, Scott Sedban is a student working at Auburn, and Candace here helped out and helped teach many of the lectures. So, okay. Well, why we thought this was a good idea was because that we kind of recognize today that transit is a really important topic and is becoming a key piece in making cities economic development, making them livable, helping deal with congestion in all these different ways. So having civil engineering students, that was our focus, understand the principles involved in these systems is really important. And we came at it from the perspective that the students don't necessarily need to know how to operate one of these things on their own, because they may not go in that career path. But if they are working in some sort of transportation field, we'd like them to be able to talk coherently about public transportation or understand the issues that public transportation systems face so that they hopefully won't hinder the growth or anything like that as they go forward. The problem with this was that not a lot of material is available in great detail at universities. I'll talk in just a second about a survey we did, but we kind of had a feeling about how this was working, which when we tried to include it in our courses, there's just kind of minimal information. So we wanted to expand that and come up with our own coursework. And the last piece of this was that transit profession has changed dramatically. Technology is now so important for public transportation. And when I was working on my PhD out in Texas, we went to many of the rural paratransit providers, and they were still dealing with adding in technology to their systems. Much of their work was done on paper still, with giant maps on the wall, which thoroughly impressed me that they were able to keep that together. So we had two main objectives that we wanted to do with this project. The first one was to identify the critical topics that we should include in a course like this, that even if they're not working in the field, they need to have an awareness of. And then the second one was to take this information and actually develop some modules that hopefully someone was going to use as a complete course, but you could easily pick and choose. If maybe you already had materials that you thought were important, you could pick something that you didn't have, or you were teaching another course that you wanted to tie in some transit material, you could pull one of our modules and work with it too. So that was the theme of this, was making some modules. And I should mention that I'm going to focus on, this project included a short undergraduate course set of modules and then a graduate, kind of upper level undergrad, if you would, course that was a semester long set of modules. And I'm going to focus on talking about that semester long set of modules because that includes all of the topics that we found that were important. We distilled it down nicely into a week's worth of lectures for the undergraduate course. So if you have questions on that undergraduate course, I'm happy to answer that too. But we did a couple surveys of both academics and the workforce to understand what was important and what we should include in this course. And that was very enlightening as to what we found. The first part was going academic. And we talked to 14 different universities, or professors at 14 different universities, and asked them to share either their syllabi or the course materials, or just give us information about what textbooks they were using. And we got lots of information that varied greatly. Some people just sent us a giant zip file with gigs of data. Other people just sent us their syllabus. But both were very useful because they told us what people were including in their courses. Here's a list of many of the ones that we had contacts from. And there may be other schools that were involved in this. We reached out to folks through the Transportation Research Board, through our personal contacts, through friends of friends and things like that. And these were the people that got back to us. So that's the information that we had. What we did was we took all of that information, and it took a while, many meetings in person to distill down all this information as to what were the top 10 things that academics are including in our courses. And you can see we ranked them actually based on the number of people that were including different topics. And this terminology was different for many different courses, so we had to find matching themes across them. But service planning was the #1 topic that was being taught, just overwhelmingly across different schools. And it kind of makes sense that they're going to focus on that side of things because it's very quantitative, mathematical, you can show the process and all things like that. Scheduling and network structures were also very common. As we moved down into the bottom half of this list, there were common threads, but they weren't as common as the top half of this list. So things like quality of service and performance management, travel demand and ridership forecasting, and then the ideas of cost were in a few universities as well. Well, that was great. So we knew what the universities wanted to do, but since we wanted to try and make this as effective as possible, we started talking to practitioners to figure out what they wanted. And we talked to, again, personal contacts, friends of friends. We actually sent emails and phone calls to most of the DOTs across the country. Whether they responded or not, really you can see the list as to what they gave us. But we did contact every single DOT. And then you can see some transit agencies here. We focused on a lot of the big ones across the country. We did some consultants as well. Their list, so here's the survey that we actually sent them. We talked to them on the phone to get information, and because they weren't going to have a syllabus to send us, we sent them a very specific questionnaire, and it was 2 pages. And it was a very kind of slick PDF where you could just go in and punch in your information and then send us back the PDF, so it was very clear. But I wanted to walk you through what we did with this, and we kind of tailored it a little bit knowing what the academics had provided to us. And the first thing was just saying, which of the following public transportation topics do you think are important? And we broke it down into the biggest categories, the things that we had seen in the academic world, whether it was planning, operations, scheduling, design, finance, things like that. And what was shocking was this other category that people wrote in tons of different things. And unfortunately, none of them showed up as important because they were all just completely varied and specific to their job or their role. But then we broke it down into 3 larger categories. The first of which was focused on design and all the different things that go in design and looking at different modes that were in there. We looked at rail, bus, paratransit, and things like that. And for each one of these topics, we asked them to rank how important it was to know whether it was unimportant all the way to extremely important for students to understand. The second category had to do with planning topics. This was everything from just general planning, how that's going to work, to getting into how organizations are set up and the management of those, like going through those different programs and things like that. The third category was based on the operations. And in this case, we wanted to know everything from the land use side of things, whether it was a transportation or transit-oriented development, whether it was financing, legislation, bidding and contracts. We didn't expect this section to be as popular as it was, actually. Based on what the academic side said, that wasn't a big piece. But we thought they were things that would come up. We talked about different software and technology that would be useful. And then there were a whole bunch of open-ended questions that focused on what did you wish you had learned as a student? Or if you hire someone new, what's the thing that you get them trained on first that they didn't have when they showed up and you're going to need to fill them in on that type of thing? So we collected all that information, and surprisingly, a lot of that matched to what we saw in the Likert scales above. So these are the ones where the knowledge skill set and the open-ended questions, the most reoccurring themes of things that practitioners wanted people to know when they were hiring them. And it was just understanding the politics and federal regulations was by far and away the most written-in response to our survey. And that was something that we didn't have really on our syllabi. The ability to write and communicate well. Again, another skill that kind of goes across all of engineering, doesn't it? But we were surprised that the transit agencies and the DOTs really emphasized that as something they wanted people to be able to do when they hired them. And lastly, understanding public transportation operations. That many of them noted along with this, sort of the caveat, that even if we're not hiring those people, when we work with other agencies or with other groups, we want them to understand what we're doing in our perspective. And that was where that phrase came from. Okay, when it came down to that first question of those big topics as to what they thought was important, these are the responses and kind of the scale of where they fell into the different topics. Pleasantly, the planning one was very popular, which is what the academics were happy with too. But the other ones that really came into the top of the list here were finance and public communication. In fact, the design and the management stuff fell to the bottom of the list. That yes, it was important for many of the transit agencies, but across the board, what people were looking for was much more of the bigger picture, how their system was going to function in the real world. Well, we redid the same thing, as we went through all of those different Likert scales for very specific topics and grouped them together to things that were similar between what we had with the academics and with these guys, the practitioners. And we put it in another top 10, where the one that had the most votes, the highest ranking scales. And in truth, we kind of simplified our Likert scales down a little bit, that amongst the scale, if it was just important and above, we included it as something that they thought was useful for a course. Well, the general planning process was atop evaluating alternatives, which is definitely part of the planning process, are up on top. The design aspects of things kind of fall into the transit route and stop design and the sidewalk design, but they're not a big piece of all of this. They're much more about the system and operating the system effectively and efficiently. One of the things that just didn't show up at all with the syllabi was this coordinating transportation systems and the interaction between different groups. That it may have been there, but it just wasn't a prominent thing that was discussed before. So we took all this information and we put it together with this course that we were going to design over an entire semester. And this was our description of what we wanted to achieve with this course. And it's going to be a comprehensive analysis of planning, design, and operation of public transportation systems in urban settings. One limitation of this, that there was so much information to include, was that we took the paratransit demand response side of things and did not include that in great detail. We focused more on well, there are of course ADA support type paratransit systems in urban areas, but we focused more on rail, buses, and things like that. But here's a list of the goals that we wanted to focus on in this course that seems to match what was important for practitioners that they would achieve when they got out into the real world, and what we thought from an academic perspective as to what we think is going to work within an educational system that we want to instill that knowledge. So here are our objectives. Everything from describing evolution benefits and challenges to being able to collect information and being able to work with information, to quantifying route level transit service characteristics and working with transit routes. That's one of the slide with objectives. In this case, we wanted to explain the service planning side of things, whether it was station and local neighborhood design, and how that was going to influence service planning, all the way down into looking at fares and technology, and the financing and support behind all of them. These are the course modules or units that we came up with to achieve all these different objectives. And again, you can pick one of these and plop it into other courses, hopefully. But we designed it as a nice flow for everything. The introduction describes what's going on in the world of transit and where we are today and many of the challenges that we face. The second one is focused on transit systems and data, and to talk about how we collect data, how we quantify transit systems in order to develop good performance measures for the future. The third one is measuring and maximizing capacity. These are different ways of, we especially focus on rail and bus capacities because there are different methodologies for both. We have service planning and network design. We start very big picture with how you come up with a network and work its way down into particular routes. We then get into staff and fleet scheduling as to how you organize all of that in that process. We discussed station design and access, and this is a section where we talk about transit-oriented development and how that factors into everything as well. The forecasting and encouraging ridership is a rather broad topic because it's where we start including all the finance issues and working within regulations and how the management of different groups all work together. So we tie that into the forecasting process and how you can use that to leverage funds and things like that. And finally, improving transit quality. This is where we really got into the new technologies and sharing information, whether that was through apps or just kind of the evolution of maps and how we show information about where you can move through a transit system. So if if you have suggestions as to things that we're missing, we are welcome. We welcome those ideas. But I assure you, many hours were spent discussing that list. Along with this, because we wanted this module to go across universities and different groups, we decided to focus on a couple key readings that are kind of open source readings that everyone should have access to. The first one is based on Human Transit by Jarrett Walker. And that's one of the more bigger picture, seeing how transit actually influences social quality of life. We have the basic TCRP report on transit capacity and quality of service. And then one of the things we start off with right off the bat to describe scale of transit systems is the public transportation fact book. But along with all of the modules that we have, each one includes references to additional readings to supplement all the information that's included in that module. So again, you can pick them up and use them. But those are the key ones that we like to return to again and again. In addition to the curriculum, we have some outreach things that we did. I know you guys did a few at Georgia Tech. These are ones that I included in my course at Auburn. We did a lot with transit data. We at Auburn have Tiger Transit, and they were very gracious and shared much of their GIS and travel data and the volume of passengers on the different vehicles. And we worked through each of the different sections in an example for them. So that was a nice way that the students could get some hands-on real-world experience. Probably their least favorite activity was actually going on board and doing the counts on those vehicles. But it was useful much later on in our discussions. We had a number of guest speakers come in, both when we first started working with the Tiger Transit. Our operator manager came in and talked about the system and how it worked. But as I mentioned, we didn't really focus too much on paratransit. So I had some folks that in Wiregrass, Alabama, that's the region, to come in and talk about how they operated their paratransit system and the pros and cons and what they were dealing with on a daily basis. And that was a great way to expose the students to all of this. And we actually took a trip over here to MARTA, which was fantastic. This is what the picture is from. And we got a great tour of the different facilities, the maintenance yard, and talked with a number of engineers who work on service planning in their system. And the students just thought that was an amazing opportunity it was actually at the very end of the course, so they knew all the different modules up into that point and were able to, I thought, talk pretty coherently and smartly about all that stuff. So where we are with this course, we have both taught one cycle of this, meaning that we have gone through it one whole semester. And we had our initial list. That list of modules that I showed you has been tweaked a little bit, simply because we've done this one time and know what worked and what didn't work. So we've gone through one iteration. We're now going through our second cycle to clean it all up. And we have a couple other professors across the country that are using parts of this or the entire course. And with our week-long undergrad version of things, which focuses very much on the different types of modes you can have and how we classify and characterize different modes and when you use them, as well as the service planning basics and kind of in-class activity to play in your own system. We have a number of them from across the country too, from Washington to Illinois to Connecticut and New York, that are using that now in their Introduction to Transportation Engineering course, which is pretty slick. When we are done with this second cycle, are going to share it with the world through Stride's website, and hopefully other people will adopt it and we'll be sharing that information. So that's where we are with our course.
And I think Jeff would love to take maybe one or two questions because we're already over. So.
I think one of the things that ought to be added is teaching the students how to increase trust of the transit agency with the general population. When Atlanta started, they totally poisoned the water, and it wasn't until about 90 that the Department of Transportation and MARTA even cooperated on any projects. So I think that needs to be taught, because they're going to go into situations where there has been distrust. And that was one of the main reasons that the general transit thing at transportation that Keith talked about this morning was defeated because it was transit heavy.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the topics we do include there is public outreach and coordination between agencies. So that's a good point.
All right, well, with that, let's thank Jeff. And I think on the schedule next, there is a short break on the second floor break area. I think there's snacks and whatnot. If you are a student in the room, there is a meeting for the ITE and WTS student chapters in the other room. And in this room at 4 o'clock, there will be a state DOT panel. So thank you very much.